anybody that doesn't. So anyone that wants to revisit this webinar and listen again to some of the thoughts that Dimitris will share today with us, you can do so as soon as we post it to our social media. And with no further ado, our educator today is Dimitris. He will be talking to us about the hidden power of rare earth metals and the rise of industrial policy in the energy transition era. Dimitris, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And let me share my my screen. Yeah, I can share it like this. And just give me 1 second. Okay, perfect. And can you see my full screen now?
Yes, it works.
Perfect. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Dimitris Symeonidis. I work as an energy market analyst. I also work as a policy advisor and project manager for innovative research projects such as renewable energy communities. And I'm also very active on the role of youth mobilization, especially in the terms of young professionals on the energy sustainability sector. And today we're going to talk about the untapped potential of rare earth metals and their whole role in how they can drive industrial policy and really transform the economies of especially of the emerging economies. So let's take a step forward with that and see a little bit on what happens today. So what happens today? We see that you can see, for example, that Australia and China currently are having, let's say, a brawl in terms of critical minerals. There is a competition in terms of resources. So this is basically fast forward to what happens with the current situation with critical minerals, how it evolved and how it is currently happening, and how basically the energy transition is contributing to this like new resource competition. But many of you might wonder, what does energy have to do with all of this? Why is it leading to this, let's say, struggle for increasing power? And to begin with, the simple answer is that procuring the right material for the energy transition is something that should be concerning, and is concerning each and every one of us, regardless of our sector or our geographical scope, because you can understand that it is something that happens worldwide, and it's also something that has to do with every single sector of the of energy. So it concerns the energy transition as a whole. And the deficiencies, as we mentioned, they affect all sectors, from generation itself, as you can see, to transmission, to distribution, to end use. And this has to do with not just electricity, this has to do also with hydrogen or with any other supply chain that might come into your mind, as we might see, as you're going to see later down the road. Also with biofuels potentially, but mostly with electricity and hydrogen, with renewable electricity and hydrogen. And they're also everywhere because essentially all of these materials and minerals, they exist throughout the globe, but also their processing facilities exist throughout the globe, and not just processing, but also the end use, which is us. It exists throughout the world. So it is something that everyone should care about. Mostly, of course, the countries that are in the mining and processing, but let's say that it's something that it essentially concerns worldwide everybody on the long term. But which materials are we talking about? Which are these rare earth materials, and which are the critical minerals that we are talking about? But let's start with the most rare of all, which also have the name that comes with their capacity, and this is the rare earth elements, which are these ones that you can see. There are 17 in total. Yeah, they're basically 17 in total, and they are mandated by their let's say rarity, that they don't really exist that much into the globe, and they are very difficult also to mine. So these are the main elements. Of course, you can see them with their chemical name, let's say. You can see, for example, it's neodymium or this modium and uranium, and there are so many of them that are within this scope. Yttrium as well, scandium, for example. We can name all of them all together. But essentially, you can see that their common situation is that they are very important for the energy transition. But in what sense are they so important for the energy transition? What do they do, and they are so important for the energy transition? This graph will essentially give like a better glimpse of how important they are, because as you can see, they are being used in magnets. Magnets are essentially everywhere in generation of electricity, and especially with regards to, for example, wind turbines. So they are, for example, essential for wind energy. They are part of catalysts, which are also super important for the energy transition. For battery alloys, batteries we're talking about all the time, about storage, which is very important. Ceramics and glass, silicon, essentially, which is also something that is an important element of most of the renewable energy units. Uh, so you can see, and also metallurgy, all of this together is what essentially makes a wind turbine. All of this together is what makes a chip or a solar panel. So these are very important to procure if we want to have all of these elements that are essentially going to power with green electricity our grids, and they're going to industrialize us if we are not industrialized yet. Otherwise, they are going to bring, let's say, the green transition. So you can see that they are ubiquitous. They are everywhere into the production of renewable energy and renewable electricity. But how can they basically reshape the economy, as we have discussed? Because it's not only that they are going to produce energy and electricity for us. This is something that happens if you see that only from, let's say, developed countries side, that they cannot really help, like, let's say, increase the growth, industrial growth any further. But if you are a country that already mines these products, and you are actually interested in developing your own industry, these are going to come extremely handy. And to this point, I want to say that it's not just like when we're talking about critical minerals and critical metals, it's an umbrella term that involves also these rare earth elements. But in addition, other ones that are being used for the energy transition, such as copper, such as silver, nickel or lithium. So like a broad umbrella term could be critical metals, critical minerals, and critical elements. So all of these, as we have mentioned, they are very much important for the energy transition. And there should be, in many countries there is not, but there should be developed a financing mechanism, a legal regulatory framework that can actually enable such industries to get established in these countries. The very difficult thing is, of course, that manufacturing and production industry is something that is very costly. So it's going to include a lot of their budget targeted towards that sector. But with the adequate, let's say, financing mechanisms on the long term, for example, countries like DR Congo, or not so much DR Congo, but Chile, for example, and yeah, to another extent, of course, Congo, for example, they can develop their own industrial policy. This has been actually studied, and the example of ASEAN, which has done this very much, developing with its own natural resources. Most of the Asian countries, they developed their own industrial policies and their own industries. And we see that, for example, in Indonesia and in Thailand and in other such countries like Malaysia, But however, in order to achieve that, regional harmony, let's say regional stability, is something very important. That's why the only region that has done this so far is Asian. The rest of the regions, Latin America, there is still instability. In Central Asia, there is fragmentation. So there is still, so it's something that is very important to happen in order to come up with the right financing mechanisms. Regional policy is something that is very important. Otherwise, it's very difficult to achieve. So you can see with the example of Asian, and you can see the example of all of these countries that, if I am, for example, Bolivia, I have cobalt, I can develop my own batteries, let's say, later down the road. This is something, of course, that will require a very sophisticated policy, but of course, but you can see that it is something that is very important. If I can develop my own batteries, I have a very big source of income as a country. So that is something that is of huge importance for the global economy, but also for the regional economies as well. But there is not, let's say, okay, we can develop our own industrial policy with these materials, but there are not enough for everyone, as you can see. Resources are very specific and, like very little. And the first thing, of course, that exists is that there is an imbalance, a constant imbalance between supply and demand. There is always a lot more demand because we need to develop our own, for example, electric vehicles. We need to build our own turbines or solar panels, and there's so much demand because each country wants to go fully green in all of its sectors. We need to create smart grids. We need to create batteries for not just for cars, but for other for storage in general as well. So we have all of these needs, and there is just not enough. And the second part is, of course, the manner of procurement, which is later getting more and more traction. We see a lot of human rights breaches and environmental rights breaches. We used to see them, especially in the past, because the countries that had this and still have these resources, they hadn't to that point developed, let's say, a legal framework to protect, let's say, these rights. And so that is very important to have. And so for these two reasons, currently there are many restrictions, many limitations that exist with the development of the energy transition. And as you can see, rare earth metals and critical minerals, they are at the epicenter of this current conundrum, of this, let's say, current bottleneck that exists. And you can see, of course, so the issue that we talked about is that, as we mentioned, let's say these materials are important not just geography-wise, but also sector-wise. They affect each and every sector of, let's say, the energy transition realm. We mentioned transmission, we mentioned generation, and we mentioned also end use. So we're going to focus on transmission and generation for the moment. And to start with the transmission, we have the transmission lines. The main, let's say, rare earth metals that comprise these grids are essentially neodymium and dysprosium. Their procurement is mostly done in China. And in addition, in terms of metals, we have the enormous need for copper. There is going to be a huge need for copper in order to build on these transmission lines, aluminum, of course, but copper is the one that is not found in such abundance. And that is the biggest issue that we're facing here. So with that into consideration, we really have to think like how we're going to procure this copper and how we're going to process it. In that sense, China is a bit of a step ahead because they have already bought several of these mines, and they are actually also very strong on the processing part. You're going to understand that basically China is one of the leading countries on the processing front of most of the materials that you have for energy transition. So they are also in copper. And here I have to say that this is the most difficult part to address, because Energy efficiency, for example, can deal with reduction in demand in end use, reduction of consumption, but it cannot do much in terms of transmission lines. This is the most difficult sector to actually procure the materials, because we do need these materials. We can achieve efficiency of the grid overall, but we are never going to not need this. We're never not going to not need copper. This infrastructure is needed. We need interconnecting lines. We need stronger grids so that we can achieve so that we can avoid congestion. And for that, these materials are very important. So in my view, copper is going to be the most important element over the next years. But of course, we don't have only the transmission lines. As we mentioned, we have the generation, we have the renewables production. Starting from the most important, let's say, element, silver is the #1 component that both solar and wind are going to have in huge need. Considering the uptake of solar energy, especially, there has been an understanding that we're going to have enormous bottlenecks, and not just that. Even the global reserves of silver in general, currently, they are not even enough to power solar uptake over the next years. Over the next, let's say, 15 years, if we want to achieve these ambitious targets that we have in terms of climate change. So with that into consideration, we really need to either find a way to recycle it or to find alternatives. For example, I think many have been looking at tin, I think, or yeah, like similar materials that can replace, that could replace silver. Similarly, iron is at the same situation in terms of bottlenecks, with Afghanistan actually having one of the biggest reserves, and in that case, it makes it extremely challenging to actually proceed with the extraction process. And then we have silicon, which is let's say, the funny thing of this is that silicon is basically sand, but like, I mean, it's very simplistic, but yeah, we can just put it that way. And the actual thing is that there has been discussion that we are running out of sand, of the specific sand that we need specifically for silicon production. So, and then we have aluminum and steel in terms of metals, for their production and their final shape. Rare earth metals again are very important. So, for example, we have again neodymium and dysmorphium. So that is these metals are again very important for that sector. So you can understand that these bottlenecks are expected to be more and more over the next years. With silver, as I mentioned, the thing is that even with all of the reserves in this world, it's very difficult to not have bottlenecks. So I really don't see any country being, let's say, the strategic winner in that case. It's really a big bottleneck, a huge one. And you can see here what we are talking about. So the different rare earth elements and their need in different sectors, from wind to fuel cells, and what sectors are needed and what is the risk. You can see that, for example, there's a very high risk for the rare earth elements for all of them, and then it's scandium, germanium, and others, which with the moderate risk being cobalt, which is abundant in Congo and Bolivia only, and so there's a very centralized procurement process, and that makes things very problematic. Especially, there have been some ideas that cobalt might not be needed due to some innovations, but if it is needed, they are even considering trying to mine from underwater, from deep down in the seabed in the Pacific Islands, and that's going to make costs much higher. And the costs, as you can see, are going to go most probably into batteries, as you might see later, in terms of where they are mostly used, where cobalt is mostly used. Which here, as I mentioned, cobalt is one of the most important elements for batteries. You have lithium. Again, here with lithium and nickel, it's not necessarily the bottleneck not necessarily exists on the reserves on the reserve sector. It's something also that Elon Musk tweeted a couple of months ago. It's not a matter of lithium mining that makes the high cost of batteries. It's the lithium processing that is the most important, because processing of the elements necessary for batteries are happening almost in total in China. More than 90% of the processing happens in China, and that really sets up the pace in terms of prices, because if there is only one who can provide, then the prices are essentially high. And that happens, of course, with nickel. With cobalt, as I mentioned, the centralization of the mining process is something that is essentially the issue here, and that's because especially these two countries, Bolivia and DR Congo, are facing also inherent political instability challenges that really bring fluctuation into prices, because if you like, prices come also with speculation, and if you're thinking that a state actor might not perform in a stable way, then this drives up the prices as well. And praseodymium, neodymium, and dysprosium are also the most important elements out of the 17 that we have seen, the rare earth elements, which brings, let's say, the number of important critical minerals and metals into at least 6 for the production of the current state of how batteries are essentially now. So if we're going to keep the same technologies, you can understand why their prices is going up the roof for the moment. Of course, if there are more processing units outside of China, and this becomes a more diversified processing part, then prices, I think, will go down in a decisive manner, at least. And we go into, let's say, the safest solution, which in that case is hydrogen. And it is the safest solution because it's only depending on 2 elements, and titanium actually is not so difficult to procure. It's actually the least difficult. The same happens with iridium as well, which are essential for fuel cells mostly. Otherwise, or for electrolyzers, so we don't really need them for the other part. And hydrogen has the benefit that it can be stored even in a tank, so the fuel cell part can actually be removed if we are, for example, talking about storage for the usage of the heavy industry. So that actually takes this necessity out of the question, because if you want to use it for the steel industry or for the cement industry, which is going to be the prevalent use for hydrogen in the future, you're essentially off the hook for bottlenecks in the supply chain. Let's say the only bottleneck that you might see is that maybe the country that is providing you with hydrogen does not have it anymore. So overall, it is, of course, a much safer solution, but it really cannot decarbonize it in such an efficient way our everyday lives. It's mostly for it's mostly for the heavy industry, and that is the main problem with hydrogen. But other than that, you can see that it is the safest bet. However, all of this, as we mentioned, it comes with inherent challenges. I mentioned throughout the description of their importance. I also mentioned that what challenges we're currently facing, and the challenges are many, and they are multi-sectoral, and they really shape the current state of affairs and make things extremely challenging, and this makes state actors really consider their options and try to make sophisticated policies to address them. So the first and the most important one are the environmental challenges. It's not necessarily the most important one. It depends on the way you see it. But when we're talking about a transition to a cleaner economy, we have to think: is this economy expected to be as clean as we're discussing? First part is that mining can be and is currently energy intensive. We have been discussing with several actors that have been consulting that they really want to test, for example, mining trucks running on hydrogen or electrified trucks or drills that also run into hydrogen or whatnot. But the current picture is still very gray and very black in terms of the energy that is used by all of these devices, which is still not clean in most countries. If you go to Latin America, if you go to Sub-Saharan Africa, they still are using let's say oil, gas, and their refined products for that reason. The second thing, especially when we're talking about countries that mentioning Bolivia, for example, the destruction of landscape can be something that causes concern. And with it come the biodiversity problems. If you destroy forests, if you basically this is for biodiversity, apart from the destruction of landscape. Of course, we're not mentioning that this is something that is happening necessarily. This is something that right now that mining becomes more intensive and more important for the energy transition, something that is actually expected to happen. These problems are expected to persist and to continue to exist in the whole realm. So this is something to really take into consideration. Of course, it's not just the environmental problems. Going deeper into the issues that exist, we're going into societal problems. Many of the violations that we have seen in terms of human rights is child labor, which is something that really goes against the basic human rights. But it is something that is a standard practice in several cases. And we have other human rights violations as well with regard to gender equality, with regard to minorities. This is a serious issue. And the other thing, of course, that leads to xenophobia is the fact that for example, if there is a mining company from another country, they tend to bring their own labor into the industrial side, into the mining side, and that really makes things a bit more difficult to operate within the country because it essentially doesn't have, let's say, the social license to operate. Because when you go into a country, when you invest there, you are expected to either keep foreign direct investment within the country, so that you basically bring money into the country, or you provide jobs to the workforce there, because that has the same value on the long term. Not the same, but a similar value. And when this doesn't happen, of course, people tend to be distressed, and this brings it brings a kind of a social unrest. We saw that in Kyrgyzstan with the mines that are operated by the Chinese. In Lesotho as well, in Africa, it has been also quite prevalent. There are cases where they start seeing, let's say, foreign labor as a threat. So that is something that that is a challenge, and each country that operates in that sense in these regions, they should take that into consideration, because the social license to operate is much more important than it seems. You have financial losses if you don't take that into account, because getting, for example, attacked by let's say an angry mob of local citizens might mean that you have to close your operations for a bit. So that means financial losses, and that also increases the bottlenecks at the end of the day, because the procurement is going to be slower, and that means the processing is going to be slower. So the production of vehicles, for example, electric vehicles or wind turbines, is going to be also much slower. So societal challenges are inherently connected with economic ones and with production ones, as you might understand. And as we're mentioning economic challenges, for the country that operates in that sense, the biggest challenge is the debt trap diplomacy and the investment gaps that exist. Because mostly in terms of the debt trap diplomacy, many of these countries, they tend to receive some loans in order to be able to do the mining process, or in order to be able to serve a part of the operations, because the operations will take part on their own land. And in many cases, they are not able to repay their loan. Another thing that happens is that they take loans just because they cannot operate with their own funds. And as part of that, when it's their time to repay their loan, because they don't have the resources, there are some countries that they end up saying that, okay, we're going to seize a specific mining site, and they tend to have this mining site. So at the end of the day, the mine itself, it doesn't really serve the country anymore. It serves the country that owns basically the debt. And the last, let's say, issue in that sense is the over-reliance on the extractives industry, the so-called resource curse, or let's say Dutch disease, that they used to call it that way. Dutch disease, it's called because the first time that they coined the term, it was because of the over-reliance of the Netherlands on the gas market. So similarly, if a country ends up being over reliant to, let's say, lithium or nickel, then for example, an innovation that might get let's say rid of those materials from batteries, it might make them go out of the market, and that means that has terrible consequences if you are a country. It's not just being a company that is going to go bankrupt. We're talking about a whole state, and that again has essential challenges with regards to the energy transition. So this is also a very important challenge that needs to be taken into consideration. Going further down the road, we have geopolitical issues. We have seen right now with the energy crisis, what the energy crisis has revealed is the over-reliance on one partner is mostly not a good idea, because it can lead to this devastating situation that we're facing currently. So it's something that it really needs to be addressed. For example, processing, microchip production, all of these, they need to be diversified if we want to have, let's say, a stable neoliberal world order. Otherwise, we are bound to face bottlenecks that are going to be unpleasant situations like the one we're facing currently. The second problem is resource nationalism. It's not necessary that it can become a problem, but we have in this case the situation in Chile, where the lithium industry got nationalized, basically the lithium extraction company. That might, of course, it's not by itself a problem, but if let's say personal national interests come into play, there are international conflicts, then that might much more ease company. So in that sense, it's not necessarily the best case. And the second reason is, of course, that each country has frictions with another one. I mean, that is something that is unavoidable in most cases. So resource nationalism can function as a bias in that sense, and that might keep one country from, let's say, giving another the resources that it requires to fuel its own energy transition. So yeah, but by itself, as I said, it's not an issue necessarily, but it might become, of course, if it's not handled adequately with the right policy tools. The other issue, of course, is something that was heightened during the pandemic, the procurement difficulties and bottlenecks. And that might happen, of course, if there is a country that decides to isolate itself for one reason or another. And the pandemic was one of these cases, but it can justify this kind of behavior. So this has been, let's say, a lesson. The procurement bottlenecks during the pandemic. It has been. It should function as a lesson for every country, for every state act energy, and to not have times that they will have to pause or interrupt because they don't have the materials. They need to diversify as much as possible. That is, let's say, the advice that should be kept also from this discussion. But in general, yeah, diversification is good in that sense. And again, as we mentioned, the issue is that the processing happens in 2-3 countries tops. Both the processing with regards to the renewable energy units, but also with other materials that are necessary for the products that we're going to use. As we mentioned, microchips are one of the most important aspects, for example, for the digitalization. So if they are not if we still rely on 2-3 countries for tops, from what I can see until now, we are essentially going to be bound by this neo-realist world order, where we'll have to wait, and we will have to hope that there is no escalating tensions that result in bottlenecks. I would like to briefly comment on the EU-led initiatives, which the one known as CBAM, which addresses mostly the environmental impact of the supply chains abroad. It's not very supportive in terms of finding the right financing for the country, for the companies to transition to, let's say, a greener supply chain, and to actually be respectful of the environmental impact. But a transparency over what emissions are being made and how the environmental challenges that we mentioned before can be mitigated. And regards to the CSDD, which is the corporate social directive, corporate social responsibility directive, essentially, it's mostly about the human rights, the societal rights issues, and corporate responsibility in general across the supply chain. This is a very new concept. It has not been approved by the parliament yet. They are still in the amendment section, and it's going to be very challenging to actually get to a solution, because it's a very complex. Respect human rights in the country that the supply chain actually starts. And the most important thing for me in that sense is that we should be respectful also of the cultural profile of each country, something that really doesn't happen at the moment, and it should actually happen. The approach should always be with regards to respecting, even if we as Europeans or anything disagree, there should be respect towards.
It's probably the connection. So for now on, how are you grasping the lecture? Is it interesting for you guys? Do you already have some questions maybe?
For me, it's really interesting. A lot of things I did not know before, actually. And
Yeah.
it's also my field of knowledge, so totally new some things. So it's good for myself.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking very much about the part of the environmental impacts of how much actually it is going on from the rare minerals itself, and how much it's actually from the industries that are doing the extractions. How much it's actually the people's maybe problem, and their how adequate they are actually working than the metals and minerals itself.
Yeah. For me, the sentence at the beginning, the shocking sentence that we will never be fully, yeah, I mean, independent. We always are depend on these raw materials. Even we can process it really like for the minimum, but we will still need some of them. So it means we have always environmental, yeah, problems, if you can say so.
Yeah, I think actually one of our participants asked a question in the registration form. What could actually be the supplements for these rare earth metals? Like, are there any alternatives? So it will be very interested if Dimitris could answer that question as well when he gets back up online.
He probably tries his best right now. Nice, you're back.
Hey, sorry, my internet got a bit sorry. Let me share my screen again. Sorry for that. Where is it? Just give me 1 second. Oh, okay. So, can you see my screen again?
Yes, it works.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, I was mentioning about the CSDD that yeah, it addresses the human rights issue, but it hasn't been approved yet. And as I mentioned, the most important aspect here is that we should really think about how we approach, let's say, outside of the EU countries, that we really should be respectful of the local cultural values, and that is something that should be addressed in this directive. But it hasn't been approved yet. We are still waiting, and this really might take much longer than expected. To close the, let's say, the whole session, okay, it's really a very challenging task, trying to procure the supply, trying to create the supply chains that are going to ensure the smooth and stable energy transition. It's really a challenge trying to procure the right materials, trying to diversify the market, trying to respect all of the human rights that exist. But how how are we going to do that? What is the way forward for this? We really need to, like we have agreed on certain targets in terms of climate change, we really need to start thinking on harmonizing our supply chain policies globally. It is of course a matter of national interests, but here is a very let's say more open interest that we have, a global one, that is to stop climate change. And we really need to put these materials in the context of fighting climate change. So we must have everyone on board if we are going to scale the energy transition. A dialogue, a creative dialogue, is much important. The policy dialogue is extremely important in the level of a Paris Agreement deal. Something like this, I think, would really revolutionize the supply chain industry. Second part, with regards to human rights and environmental rights, is the role of civil society in the global south. The local civil society actors, local NGOs, they kind of lack the capacity, let's say, to advocate with the decision makers, to mobilize citizens in of course a peaceful and stable way, to have their rights taken into consideration. This is something that needs a very swift and very slick civil society. So this is also why funds should be mobilized to support this civil society from all actors, if we are to have, let's say, a smooth transition also with regards to respecting human rights and enhancing the rule of law in these countries. Resource diplomacy should instead take place instead of resource nationalism, and regional policies should be a key on that regard. There should be more collaboration. For an example is the collaboration between Indonesia and Singapore now to transfer renewable electricity. That is something that sets up the pace, because these two state actors, they were not in good terms. So this makes something that is of huge importance for the energy transition. And with that, having said that, of course, we really need to take that into consideration. Reskilling and upskilling of citizens is also of enormous importance. And last but not least, the role of youth should be at the epicenter of this. We can train people, we can really make a difference, we can mobilize people as we are. This is something that is very important for the energy transition. I would like to thank you very much for staying and for having the patience. I would love to ponder with you on the current supply chain saga. So feel free to ask me now or contact me via email or on LinkedIn. I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative for all of us, I believe. Well, for most of us personally, we aren't really from your specialty, so but we're constantly interested and trying to learn, be curious about everything. So thank you so much again. And if anybody has some questions, now is the time to ask them. But in case somebody is still thinking about how to formulate, we do have some questions that our participants sent to us via registration emails. One of the questions are, how can these rare earth elements be utilized for application in biological sensors for detection of glucose or vitamin D? It's a bit more probably on the biological side, but maybe you have some info about this.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I'm not the most knowledgeable in that sense, and although I am very much interested in seeing how biomass, for example, can be transformed into bioenergy. I mean, in that sense, I don't really have much to say. Let's say, I mean, for sensors technology, they can definitely be of value, like rare earth metals. They are already used, so I'm sure that for biological sensors, they can really play an important role. So yeah, like overall, I really see that they could be of value, but with their current pricing levels, it is something that is very challenging to actually, yeah, to actually take into consideration.
Thank you. I was actually wondering, is it possible to have any alternatives to these rare earth metals, since we hear constantly about problems during the extractions, the industries that are not very on a good are not in a good sense with the social aspect, and don't have a good reputation in the social part. So just to think a little bit outside the box, are there any alternatives?
Yeah, that is a great question, and let's say that is the $1 million question in that sense, because actually there has been a lot of research with that regard. For example, in the solar panel industry, there has been, let's say, this revolutionary method of using perovskites for the production, instead of using some metals that they're using, which is supposed to be revolutionary. It's still at a very early process. They're also trying to, as I mentioned, to use tin instead of some metals, not silver necessarily, for example, instead of aluminum. But all of this, I think that their process is very, very slow. They're still trying to mix, for example, 20% of tin. This is barely going to make any difference. We also hear a lot that they have found a way to make all of these solar panels, or they have, like, for example, 100% efficiency. They're going to have like this, and we're not going to use any of the metals. Similarly, it happens with batteries. They are talking about, for example, not using cobalt anymore. But until I see this, I'm very skeptical, because yeah, there are a lot of people that are championing these, but yeah, until I see them, I will still be very skeptical, and I remain very skeptical about this. And yeah, like, I also have to point out that recent macroeconomic reports are also very pessimistic in terms of like reducing, let's say, even further the price of renewables. So, but I hope, like, we keep hope for that, definitely.
Yeah, but I'll believe it when I see it, as there is a saying.
Yeah,
One more.
exactly.
Did anybody have any other questions? Maybe Ike?
Yeah, hello.
Hi, do you have any questions?
Yes, Dimitris, thank you for this presentation as usual. Just how do we now find a balance between the extraction and the environmental factors that we have listed?
Yeah, this is a great question, and indeed, it's very difficult to. Yeah, I mean, finding the balance is actually something that it has been very difficult so far, because there was no framework. So, if, let's say, a company was not obliged to provide any credentials that they are not that they are respecting the environment, they would never do that, and that's what they used to do until now. And if you see, I should have had, like, another graph that I have seen in a presentation by consulting group. There was this idea of how let's say they have incorporated social and environmental responsibility into the reporting and supply chains, the different companies. And if you go across the supply chain, you see a lot of corporate responsibility on the end use. But if you go into the first materials, the raw materials, there is hardly any such consideration. And this happens for two reasons. The first one is that they're basically invisible to the regular citizens, these kinds of companies, and the framework was not there. But now these things they do not exist. So I think they will start to consider it. And I also think that we can definitely strike a balance between producing a lot and at the same time being respectful towards the environment. But it will require a lot of support from the different governments and financial institutions, as it happens already with the energy transition. So we will need some additional, let's say, state support for sure. It is a big challenge, but and it will require, let's say, much more money into the let's say the energy transition. But I think we can strike it at the end of the day. Thank you.
Okay, so in other words, there has to be a lot of collaboration and cooperation between industry stakeholders and the governments and probably the resident communities. Yes.
Exactly. It's a matter of collaboration between civil society, as you mentioned, and as I had mentioned as well. They can also play a huge role, and local state actors, the international institutions, and the companies themselves, which so far did not happen because there was always someone who didn't want to play ball, who wanted to play along. But now. With the current developing framework, I think we will start seeing a lot of more responsible practices from these companies as well.
Okay. Thank you for your responses. Highly appreciate it.
I have just one more question. The monitoring of these companies that are actually due to do the explorations and the industries, how is it actually proceeded? Do you have any good strategies to share, or examples of actually being by the book and not harming the environment or the communities that they're operating in?
Yeah, well, that is a very good question. I mean, they like the classic method, of course, is the environmental impact assessments, the socioeconomic impact assessments, which are becoming more of a trend right now, let's say a good trend. So you have to, let's say, report all of the moves that you're going to make within the local communities. We had done like some similar as part of like a consulting project with Airbus and Embraer, and it was really interesting to see that it's important to even mention the indigenous communities, for example, that they're not going to be harmed. You have to make all of these assessments. You have to assess, let's say, you have to keep some biodiversity indicators into consideration, and you have to measure them. The same goes for CO2 emissions, other, for example, short-lived pollutants and other pollutants emissions. You have to keep track of them and to have some indicators that both you and the monitoring authority agrees. And yeah, with regards to the social communities, there are other indicators, such as the fact that you're going to hire people that are from there, and you're going to use them there. You're going to, let's say, make the economy work better in that country. There are several cases where I think Chile has done a really good job up to that point with, let's say, as a successful example. However, like most of them, they are not like that at the moment. Yeah, this is, let's say, the main way. And of course, the emissions that you measure, they should go into the whole process. So you have to say what kind of vehicles you use. So this kind of reporting mechanisms, they really help monitor the situation. And that is, while we have, as long as we have these kind of reporting mechanisms, we will be good. But of course, we do not have to make them as complex as bureaucracy is itself right now. We need to make them also simple so that it's much easier for these companies to abide and to play by the book. So that is shortly yeah, the whole mechanism, let's say.
I do have also one more question, if this is okay. First, really
Yeah,
thank
sure.
you for the presentation. It was really insightful for me. One sentence really stuck in my mind. It's that you said at the very beginning, not very beginning, but in the first part, that we are really depend on it. We can reduce the use of raw metals and all we're doing, but we are still depend. It will probably never change. But do you have a short example why or where, in which field we reduce already the raw materials and how maybe?
Yeah, that is also a very good question. And what I mentioned and what I meant was mostly in terms of energy efficiency, for example, or in terms of energy savings. So it's something that you can more easily do on the end use, or that it can affect generation, let's say. So, for example, if you need rare earth metals to produce batteries or to produce fuel cells, if we start implementing these energy savings methods and these energy efficiency methods, or we purchase more efficient, let's say, yeah, more efficient and enduring products, we're going to need, for example, to repair or to maintain even more rarely. So that is going to reduce, let's say, the need for consumption. Also, reducing the need for consumption of energy reduces the need for installing new units of energy to produce. So that is something that where we actually can, and I mean in Europe we actually did during this energy crisis, we reduced consumption, so that had, let's say, some implications on that. It had implications, of course, on gas consumption, but if we were fully renewable, it would have on the renewable side a much better, let's say, it would have like positive implications on that side. What we can't do to reduce, as I mentioned, is that we're still going to need infrastructure. We are going to need to change transmission lines or to add transmission lines and interconnections. So there are some things that we cannot avoid for sure. But to some extent, we can reduce at least consumption.
Is it also possible to recycle raw materials?
Yeah, that is also something that I think I have a slide for that, but it is a very brief one. It was on the batteries, but of course there are more. Yeah, this is basically, for example, yeah, these three rare earth elements. We can actually recycle them to some extent. They have tried to recycle lithium outside of solar panels. They are actually trying to recycle solar panels at large. At the moment, there is such a project in the Netherlands, but it will not be it is not cost effective at the moment. It drives prices extremely high, so that still is not very helpful. Maybe sometime it will become cost efficient. Yeah. So at the moment, it kind of happens and it can happen, but yeah, it's still very expensive.
Yeah, not economically worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, like yeah, no worries. Yeah, this is the case with this is also what I had read in the macroeconomic report, that still like most of the part of the renewables is depending upon subsidies in order to have a financially profitable model. So we're still a long way from having a fully functional grid, renewable energy grid, but one can be hopeful.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I believe I can say thank you to everybody that joined our webinar. A special thanks to Dimitris for sharing his knowledge and his time with us. And don't forget to stay connected to GEC community. Don't miss our future events and stay curious and continue learning. So bye, everybody.
Enjoy. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Have a nice week. Goodbye.
So.